The Second World War. We all know the images, the bombed-out cities, the trench warfare, the iconic leaders. But what if I told you the war wasn't just fought on the battlefield? What if I told you one of its most decisive fronts was fought in America's bank accounts, and that this hidden economic war not only changed the outcome, but also laid the foundation for an unprecedented era of American prosperity? Let's set the scene. It's late 1940. Europe is on fire. Nazi Germany, a seemingly unstoppable force, has blitzed its way across the continent. France has fallen. Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, all under the Nazi jackboot. Britain stands alone, battered and bruised after the Battle of Britain, its cities pounded nightly by the Luftwaffe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill knows his nation is hanging on by a thread. They have the will to fight, but they're running out of everything else. Planes, ships, guns, and most importantly, money. At this point, the United States is officially neutral. The memory of World War I is still fresh, and the American public is overwhelmingly against getting dragged into another European conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, is walking a tightrope. He sees the existential threat that Nazi Germany poses to the world, but he also has to respect the powerful isolationist sentiment at home. The British are desperate. They've spent nearly all their gold reserves buying weapons from the US under a cash-and-carry policy. Now, the well is dry. Churchill sends a desperate, secret plea to Roosevelt. He lays it out in stark terms. Without immediate and massive help from America, Britain will fall. And if Britain falls, the Atlantic becomes a German lake, and America will be next. FDR knows he has to act, but he can't just declare war or openly give Britain billions of dollars. The American public wouldn't stand for it. He needs a plan, a clever way to help the Allies without technically breaking neutrality. And so, in the quiet corridors of power in Washington, D.C., an idea begins to form. An idea so audacious, so brilliant, it would reshape the global balance of power forever. Roosevelt introduces this idea to the American people with a simple yet powerful analogy. He says, suppose my neighbor's house catches fire and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. What is the transaction that goes on? I don't want $15, I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. This simple story was the public face of one of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history. The Lend-Lease Act, signed into law in March 9 months before Pearl Harbor, it was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. The official title was an act to promote the defense of the United States, and on the surface, its purpose was just that. It gave the president the authority to sell, transfer, exchange, lease, or lend equipment and supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. It sounds straightforward, but let's peel back the layers. This wasn't charity. It was a strategic masterstroke. While America was publicly declaring its neutrality, it was secretly becoming the arsenal of democracy. This wasn't just about lending a garden hose. It was about turning on a fire hydrant of industrial might, aimed directly at the Axis powers. Initially, the primary recipient was Great Britain. But soon, the program expanded. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Lend-Lease program was extended to them as well. Suddenly, America-made trucks, tanks, planes, and food were flowing to the Eastern Front, helping the Red Army halt and eventually push back the German war machine. Over 40 countries would eventually receive Lend-Lease aid. This was the hidden deal that changed the war. Without Lend-Lease, Britain may well have been forced to negotiate a peace with Hitler. Without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union might have collapsed under the initial German onslaught. It allowed the Allies to keep fighting while America was still technically on the sidelines. It bought time, precious, invaluable time. But here's the other side of the coin, the part of the story that's often overlooked. Lend-Lease wasn't just a foreign policy tool. It was an incredible economic opportunity. The United States was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed, and factories were sitting idle. Lend-Lease changed all of that. It was a massive, government-funded stimulus package disguised as wartime aid. To meet the colossal demand from the Allies, American factories had to be retooled, expanded, and run around the clock. Shipyards that had been quiet for a decade roared back to life, building ships faster than the German U-boats could sink them. Detroit's auto plants stopped making family cars and started churning out tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. This wasn't just about making weapons. The Allies needed everything. They needed food, so American farms went into overdrive. They needed oil, so American refineries ramped up production. They needed clothing, medical supplies, raw materials, and America provided it all. This massive industrial mobilization put millions of Americans back to work. It ignited an economic boom unlike anything the world had ever seen. The government was essentially placing gigantic orders with American companies, guaranteeing them profits and creating jobs. It was the ultimate public-private partnership, fueled by the urgency of a world at war. So while the public narrative was one of aiding desperate allies and defending democracy from afar, the underlying reality was a massive economic transformation. America wasn't just lending supplies, it was selling them on credit, securing its own economic future in the process. The deal was simple. The Allies would do the bulk of the fighting and dying in the early years, and America would supply the tools, effectively underwriting the war effort while its own economy boomed. It was a cold, hard calculation hidden within a noble cause. FDR had found a way to support the Allies, prepare America for the war he knew was coming, and pull his country out of the worst economic crisis in its history, all with a single piece of legislation. It was a deal that would have staggering consequences, not just for the outcome of the war, but for the shape of the post-war world and America's dominant place within it. But while Europe was burning, American factories were about to roar, and the true machinery of wealth was just waking up. We've seen how the deal was made, but how did this industrial engine actually work? What did it look like on the ground, and how did it turn America into the undisputed economic superpower of the 20th century? Now, let's witness its astonishing transformation. Factories roared, workers thrived, and the richest nation on earth was quietly printing money. This is the story of the machinery of wealth. Before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, America's industrial heart was already starting to beat faster. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a shrewd political operator, knew that the conflicts brewing in Europe and Asia were not just distant problems. They were an opportunity. In 1940, he gave a famous speech, calling on America to become the great arsenal of democracy. This wasn't just a powerful phrase, it was a business plan, a plan that would kickstart the biggest industrial boom the world had ever seen. The scale of this mobilization is hard to wrap your head around. Imagine a country that, just a few years earlier, had millions unemployed, with factories sitting silent and covered in dust. Suddenly, these same factories were humming with a new purpose. The government, through programs that would evolve into Lend-Lease, began placing massive orders. We're talking about an unprecedented demand for everything a modern army could need. Think about the numbers. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced an astonishing 300,000 aircraft. That includes legendary planes like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the P-51 Mustang. It built over 86,000 tanks, churning out Sherman tanks so quickly that they became a symbol of American industrial might. Add to that, nearly 2.5 million trucks, 500,000 artillery pieces, and billions of rounds of ammunition. The real genius was in the conversion. A company that made refrigerators. Now, it was making machine guns. An automobile plant in Detroit that once assembled family sedans. It was repurposed, almost overnight, to produce the engines for bombers or to assemble the chassis for jeeps. Ford's massive Willow Run plant, for example, went from an empty field to producing a B-4 Liberator bomber almost every hour at its peak. This was American ingenuity and mass production on a scale never before imagined. Everyday factories became war profit machines. Lend-Lease was the engine driving this. The act, passed in March 1941, was on the surface. It allowed the U.S. to lend or lease war supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. The primary recipients were the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and other allied nations. But let's be clear, this wasn't charity. Who was paying for all this? The American taxpayer, through the government. The U.S. government effectively became the single biggest customer for American industry. It placed the orders, paid the manufacturers, and then shipped the goods overseas. This created a guaranteed, risk-free market for American businesses. If you owned a factory, you no longer had to worry about consumer demand or economic downturns. You had Uncle Sam knocking on your door with a contract worth millions, sometimes billions, of dollars. This created a virtuous cycle for the American economy. The government spent money, factories hired workers, and those workers, now earning a steady paycheck for the first time in a decade, spent their money on goods and services, further stimulating the economy. Unemployment, which had been as high as 25% during the Depression, plummeted. By 1944, it was an almost unbelievable 1.2%. The war effort effectively solved the unemployment crisis that had plagued the nation for over a decade. Women, who had largely been excluded from industrial jobs, flooded into the workforce. The Rosie the Riveter icon wasn't just propaganda. It was a reality for millions of American women who took on demanding, skilled jobs in factories and shipyards, proving they could do the work just as well as men. This not only boosted production but also fundamentally changed the social fabric of the nation. But it wasn't a simple, feel-good story. There were fierce political debates raging in Washington. Before America entered the war, a powerful isolationist movement, championed by figures like Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee, argued passionately against getting involved in Europe's war. They saw Lend-Lease not as helping allies, but as a backdoor to war, a way for Roosevelt to drag the country into a conflict it wanted no part of. They argued it was a massive giveaway, a drain on American resources that should be used at home. Senator Robert Taft, a leading opponent, called Lend-Lease a blank check for the president to wage an undeclared war. He and others feared that it would entangle the U.S. in foreign commitments and bankrupt the nation. They asked a critical question. Were we really helping the Allies, or were we just helping ourselves to a massive, government-funded, industrial contract? The proponents, of course, saw it differently. They argued that if Britain and the Soviet Union fell, the U.S. would be left to face the Axis powers alone. In their view, Lend-Lease was a strategic investment in American security. Roosevelt famously used the analogy of lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. You don't ask for payment then and there. You lend the hose to put out the fire before it spreads to your own house. You worry about getting the hose back, or getting paid for it, later. This analogy was brilliant, politics, but it glossed over the economic reality. The hose wasn't just a hose. It was billions of dollars worth of advanced weaponry and industrial goods. And the U.S. wasn't just a friendly neighbor. It was a global economic power, positioning itself for the post-war world. Every tank, every plane, every shipload of supplies sent overseas under Lend-Lease didn't just help the Allies fight, it also strengthened American industry, created American jobs, and generated enormous profits for American corporations. The total value of Lend-Lease aid was over $50 billion. In today's money, that's equivalent to more than $700 billion. It was a staggering sum that supercharged the American economy. While the rest of the world's industrial centers were being bombed into ruble in Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union, American factories were safe, thousands of miles from the front lines, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This gave the United States a monumental, almost unfair, advantage. By the end of the war, the U.S. was responsible for producing nearly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. Its industrial capacity had doubled, while that of its main competitors had been decimated. The war that destroyed so much of the world was, in purely economic terms, the best thing that had ever happened to American industry. The machinery of war had become a machine for generating unprecedented wealth. But this wealth came with a catch, a hidden ledger that would define the next chapter of global history. As American factories printed wealth, the Allies were falling deeper and deeper into debt, and America held the checkbook. The Allies were desperate, and America held the checkbook. By 1941, Britain was fighting for its life, nearly bankrupt from the relentless war against the Axis powers. Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously told President Roosevelt that the British were running out of money. The solution? A program that would change the course of the war and reshape the global economy forever. Lend-Lease, but this wasn't just charity. It was the most strategic business deal in history. Welcome to part 3 of our series on how America's economy boomed during World War II. In our last episode, we saw how the nation transformed into the arsenal of democracy. Today, we are peeling back the layers of the Lend-Lease Act to see how this lifeline to the Allies also became a golden ticket for American industry. Was it a rescue mission, or was it the ultimate power play? The concept of Lend-Lease was deceptively simple. Instead of selling weapons for cash, which the Allies no longer had, the U.S. would lend or lease war materials. The official line was that these supplies would be returned or paid for after the war. Roosevelt used a brilliant analogy to sell it to the American public. He said, "Suppose my neighbor's house catches fire. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation, 'Neighbor, my garden hose costs me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it.' I don't want $15, I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." It sounded neighborly, and in many ways, it was. America sent an staggering amount of aid. We're talking over $50 billion worth of goods, which is equivalent to nearly $700 billion today. The sheer scale is hard to comprehend. We sent planes, tanks, trucks, fuel, food, and raw materials. Britain was the largest recipient, getting over $31 billion in aid. This support was absolutely critical. It kept the Royal Air Force flying and the British people fed. Without Lend-Lease, it's very likely Britain would have been forced to negotiate with Hitler. The Soviet Union was another major beneficiary, receiving over $11 billion in aid. This was a politically tricky move, given the deep mistrust between the capitalist US and the communist USSR. But pragmatism won. Roosevelt knew that keeping the Soviet army fighting on the Eastern Front was essential to defeating Germany. So, America sent thousands of tanks, aircraft, and, most importantly, nearly 500,000 trucks and jeeps. These vehicles gave the Red Army the mobility it desperately needed to push the German forces all the way back to Berlin. Stalin himself later admitted that, without American production, the Allies could not have won the war. Other nations received aid too. China got crucial supplies to continue its long and brutal fight against Japan. The Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle were equipped and supplied. In total, more than 30 countries received Lend-Lease aid. It was a global supply chain operation unlike anything the world had ever seen. And at the center of it all was the United States. American factories were humming 24/7, and American ships were crisscrossing the oceans, delivering the tools of war. But let's go back to Roosevelt's garden hose analogy. It was a great piece of political marketing, but it left out a few key details. This wasn't just about getting the hose back. The Lend-Lease agreements were complex financial instruments with long-term implications. The repayment wasn't always about returning the exact items, which was often impossible. A tank destroyed on the battlefield can't be returned. Instead, repayment came in other forms, what the agreements called reverse Lend-Lease, where Allies provided services, real estate for U.S. bases, or raw materials. More importantly, the act was designed to ensure a post-war world that was favorable to American economic interests. The agreements often included clauses that required recipient nations to eliminate trade barriers and tariffs after the war. Britain, for example, had a system called imperial preference, which gave favorable trade terms to countries within its empire. The U.S. wanted that system dismantled to open up those markets to American goods. So, while Lend-Lease was saving Britain from defeat, it was also helping to dismantle the very economic foundations of the British Empire, paving the way for American economic dominance. It was a masterful stroke of geopolitical and economic strategy. Now, who was actually making all of these goods? American corporations, of course, and they were getting paid handsomely by the U.S. government, which was footing the bill for Lend-Lease. The government signed massive contracts with companies across the country, guaranteeing profits and underwriting expansion. This is where we see the birth of many of the global giants we know today. Take the auto industry. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler retooled their assembly lines to pump out an incredible number of military vehicles and aircraft engines. GM alone produced more war material than the entire Axis power of Italy. The famous Willow Run plant, built by Ford, was a mile-long factory that, at its peak, was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. These government contracts were incredibly lucrative and fueled massive growth. The same story played out in aerospace. Companies like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed went from being relatively small players to industrial titans. The demand for long-range bombers and fighter planes was insatiable. The government not only paid for the planes, but also often funded the construction of the factories needed to build them. These companies ended the war with state-of-the-art facilities and years of experience in mass production, positioning them to dominate the commercial aviation market for decades to come. It wasn't just about hardware. American agriculture also boomed. Lend-Lease included vast quantities of food to feed Allied soldiers and civilians. Farmers were encouraged to produce more than ever before, with the government guaranteeing purchase. This led to a huge increase in mechanization and efficiency in American farming. Companies that processed and packaged food, like spam producer Hormel, or the companies that would later become Kraft Foods, saw their business explode. Even the finance and shipping industries reaped enormous benefits. Loans had to be managed, insurance had to be underwritten, and all of these goods had to be transported across treacherous, submarine-infested waters. This created a massive demand for shipping, which revitalized the American merchant marine. Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate, became famous for his Liberty ships. Using new prefabrication and welding techniques, his shipyards could assemble a massive cargo ship in a matter of weeks, sometimes even days. It was an industrial miracle, and it was all paid for by the American taxpayer as part of the war effort. So, while the money was flowing to the Allies in the form of goods, the actual cash was being injected directly into the American economy. The U.S. government essentially became the single largest customer for American businesses. This massive government spending, funded by war bonds and higher taxes, is what ultimately pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression for good. Unemployment, which had been crippling the nation for a decade, practically vanished. When the war ended, the question of repayment came due. Most of the Lend-Lease debt was eventually written off or settled for pennies on the dollar. The U.S. recognized that forcing war-torn allies into crippling debt would be counterproductive to rebuilding a stable, post-war world. Britain, for instance, settled its massive bill for a relatively small long-term loan, which it finally finished paying off in 2006. The Soviet Union's debt became a point of contention during the Cold War and was never fully repaid. But the real repayment for the U.S. wasn't in cash. It was in the New World Order that emerged from the ashes of the war. America ended the conflict with its industrial base not just intact, but stronger than ever before. Its competitors, both friends and foes, wearing rins. The U.S. held most of the world's gold. Its currency was the global standard, and its corporations were poised to expand into the new, open markets that Lend-Lease had helped create. The garden hose had not only put out the fire, it had also watered the seeds of an American economic empire. This was the genius, and perhaps the cynicism, of the Lend-Lease program. It was an act of solidarity that saved the world from tyranny. But it was also a brilliantly executed business strategy that secured America's position as the world's undisputed economic superpower for the rest of the 20th century. The deal of the century, indeed. But while the money flowed and the factories churned, a darker side of the boom began to surface. Ethical questions started to rise about the immense profits being made from the conflict. Millions were dying on battlefields and in bombed-out cities. And yet America's balance sheets were thriving. Was it right to get so rich from such a devastating war? In the midst of global chaos, with millions perishing overseas, America's balance sheets flourished. A stark, uncomfortable truth hangs over the Lend-Lease Act. While the world burned, America's economy ignited. This wasn't just about helping allies. It was about business. And business, as they say, was booming. But this raises a profound ethical question. How do you reconcile profiting from a conflict that is causing unimaginable suffering? Is it possible to be both a savior and a profiteer? This is the heart of the Lend-Lease debate. On one side, you had political insiders and titans of industry who saw an unprecedented opportunity. They argued that revitalizing America's economy was a necessary byproduct of aiding democracy. Henry Ford, despite his complicated and often controversial views, saw his factories churn out B-4 bombers at an astonishing rate. His company, along with giants like General Motors and DuPont, pivoted from cars and chemicals to tanks and explosives. Their stock prices soared, and their influence in Washington grew exponentially. This was, in their eyes, capitalism at its most audacious, and, frankly, its most patriotic. They weren't just building weapons. They were building a stronger America, pulling the nation out of the lingering shadows of the Great Depression. The argument was simple. A strong American economy was essential to winning the war. Every tank, every plane, every bullet shipped overseas was a testament to American industrial might, and a source of jobs and prosperity back home. But on the other side, a chorus of critics raised their voices. Figures like Senator Robert Taft and famed aviator Charles Lindbergh, leading voices in the America First Committee, were deeply skeptical. They saw Lend-Lease not as a noble act of aid, but as a backdoor entry into a war America had no business fighting. They argued that the program was a scheme concocted by powerful industrialists and interventionist politicians to line their own pockets. They pointed to the immense profits being made and asked a piercing question. Was this truly about defending freedom? Or was it about enriching a select few? They painted a picture of a nation being dragged into conflict by a powerful elite who stood to gain financially and politically. To them, the claim of neutrality was a sham, a thin veil covering a calculated, profit-driven agenda. The debate wasn't just political. It was a moral battle for the soul of the nation. Let's look at the key figures who were at the center of this storm. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the architect of Lend-Lease, masterfully navigated these turbulent waters. He framed the program as an act of enlightened self-interest, famously using the analogy of lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. You don't haggle over the price. You put out the fire to stop it from spreading to your own home. This simple, powerful metaphor resonated with many Americans. But behind the scenes, Roosevelt was also a shrewd political operator. He knew that to get Lend-Lease passed, he needed the support of big business. So, he worked closely with men like William S. Knudsen, the president of General Motors, whom he appointed to lead the Office of Production Management. Knudsen was instrumental in mobilizing American industry for war production, and in doing so, he and his peers in the corporate world saw their fortunes swell. Another key player was Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury. He was the man in charge of the money, the one who managed the massive financial transactions that underpinned Lend-Lease. He wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a true believer in the Allied cause and worked tirelessly to ensure the flow of supplies was uninterrupted. Yet, his position also put him at the nexus of government and finance, where decisions worth billions were made. These men, and many others like them, became the faces of America's wartime boom. They weren't necessarily war profiteers in the villainous sense, but their actions undeniably intertwined national interest with personal and corporate financial gain. The line between public service and private profit became incredibly blurry. Was it possible to serve the country while also making a fortune? For many in this era, the answer was a resounding yes. They saw no contradiction. Their success was America's success. This fusion of patriotism and profit created a new class of American power brokers. The war effort transformed the American economy from the ground up. Small towns boomed into industrial centers overnight. Millions of people, including women and minorities who had been excluded from the workforce, found new opportunities in factories and shipyards. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just a slogan. It was a reality that reshaped the social and economic fabric of the country. But this prosperity came with a moral cost that we are still grappling with today. The narrative of America as the reluctant hero drawn into a war to save the world, is a powerful one, but the financial records tell a more complex story. They show a nation that, while making immense sacrifices, also secured its position as the world's preeminent economic power. The profits from Lend-Lease and war production didn't just end the Great Depression. They laid the foundation for decades of American prosperity and global dominance. The war was a tragedy for the world, but for the American economy, it was a catalyst unlike any other. It was a time of great paradoxes, where heroes were also businessmen, and a fight for freedom was also a monumental financial transaction. And just when the war seemed over, America's financial victory was only beginning, reshaping the world order forever. The smoke cleared, the treaties were signed, and World War II came to an end. But for America, the real conquest had just begun. This wasn't a conquest of tanks and soldiers, but of dollars and influence. The world was in ruins, but the United States stood tall, untouched by the devastation that had ravaged Europe and Asia. Its factories were humming, its gold reserves were overflowing, and it held the IOUs of nearly every allied nation. The stage was set for the rise of a new kind of empire, one built not on territory, but on economic power. The Lend-Lease Act, sold to the American public as a noble effort to arm the arsenal of democracy, turned out to be the most profitable investment in history. While Britain, France, and the Soviet Union bled on the battlefields, America was lending, leasing, and selling. By the war's end, the U.S. economy had more than doubled in size. It accounted for half of the world's manufacturing output and held 2/3 of the world's gold. The British pound, once the king of global currencies, was on life support. The dollar was ready to take the throne. This wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. The post-war world was being redrawn, and America held the pen. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, even before the final shots were fired, the new global financial order was established. The U.S. dollar was crowned the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both largely backed and influenced by American capital, were created to oversee this new system. Any nation that wanted to rebuild, to trade, to participate in the new global economy, had to play by America's rules and use America's currency. The debt from Lend-Lease was a powerful tool of leverage. Britain, for example, emerged from the war victorious but bankrupt. To secure a post-war loan from the U.S., they had to agree to dismantle their imperial preference system, which gave favorable trade terms to colonies within the British Empire. This opened up a vast, previously protected market to American goods. One by one, the old colonial empires crumbled, not just from a desire for independence, but because they were no longer economically viable without the backing of a superpower. America didn't need to conquer these territories. It just needed to trade with them. The age of colonialism was ending, and the age of economic neocolonialism was dawning. Lend-Lease also created a global network of dependency. Nations that had received American tanks, planes, and jeeps now needed American spare parts, American ammunition, and American technical expertise to maintain them. TS military-industrial relationship didn't end in 1945. It evolved, laying the groundwork for Cold War alliances like NATO. American military bases sprung up around the globe, not just as a check against Soviet expansion, but also to protect American economic interests and trade routes. The arsenal of democracy had become the marketplace of the world, and its military was its security guard. Think about it. The Marshall Plan, lauded as a generous act to rebuild a shattered Europe, was also a masterstroke of economic policy. It pumped billions of American dollars into European economies. But there was a catch. A lot of that money had to be spent on American goods. This not only prevented Europe from falling into the Soviet sphere of influence, but also created a massive captive market for American exports, preventing a post-war recession back home. American companies like Ford, Coca-Cola, and Hollywood studios flooded the European market, and with them came American culture. The American dream was exported and sold, becoming a global aspiration. So, we have to ask the difficult question. Was World War II really a fight for freedom and democracy? Or was it, from a certain perspective, the most audacious and successful business venture in human history? The sacrifices of the soldiers on the ground were real, their bravery undeniable. They fought and died for a noble cause. But behind the front lines, in the halls of power, and on the trading floors of Wall Street, another war was being waged, a war for economic supremacy. The outcome of this war determined the shape of the world for the next 75 years. This empire of influence is more subtle than the empires of old. It doesn't rule with governors and viceroys, but with interest rates and trade agreements. Its legions aren't soldiers in foreign capitals, but a web of financial institutions, multinational corporations, and the pervasive power of the US dollar. Every time you use a dollar or see a product made in the USA, you're seeing a tiny echo of this system, a system born from the ashes of the world's greatest conflict. The Lend-Lease Act wasn't just a wartime measure. It was the down payment on a new world order, one in which America was the CEO. History remembers the soldiers, the generals, and the politicians, but few remember the bankers, the economists, and the industrialists who planned the world that would come after. Until now. Share this story, because understanding how the system was built is the only way to understand the world we live in today, before the hidden truth is forgotten.